There's a quiet myth we're taught early on, that speaking everything aloud is healthy, that transparency is always a virtue, that being open makes us stronger. But the mind doesn't work that way. Some thoughts don't dissolve when spoken. Some truths don't heal when shared. They weaken, distort, or turn against us. Carl Jung understood this uncomfortable reality. He didn't believe the inner world was meant to be constantly exposed. He believed it was meant to be understood, slowly and privately. As he once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. What he implied, but rarely softened, is that exposure is often a form of avoidance. We talk instead of thinking. We confess instead of integrating. We hand pieces of ourselves to others, so we don't have to sit with them alone. There is a difference between honesty and self-betrayal, between clarity and oversharing. Not everything inside you needs a witness. Some things need time. Some need pressure. Some need silence to reveal their true shape. The darker truth is this: once something leaves you, it no longer belongs to you. It becomes filtered through someone else's biases, insecurities, and limitations. What was once precise becomes simplified. What was once fragile becomes negotiable. Jung warned, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And darkness, by its nature, does not respond well to crowds. This isn't about secrecy as manipulation. It's about containment as strength, about knowing that certain parts of you grow best when untouched, unnamed, and unexamined by those who haven't earned the responsibility of knowing them. So before you speak, before you explain yourself, justify yourself, or reveal yourself, it's worth asking, is this truth asking to be shared, or is it asking to be understood first? Because there are things you should never tell anyone about, not because they're shameful, but because they're powerful. Once you understand that not every truth benefits from being spoken, the next question becomes more uncomfortable. Which truths cost you the most when you give them away? The answer isn't dramatic. It's quiet, ordinary, and deeply personal. The most dangerous disclosures aren't scandals or secrets. They're the small, honest admissions you offer without realizing how exposed they leave you. And none are more vulnerable than the ones that sit closest to your sense of worth. Which brings us to the first thing you should never tell anyone about: your deepest insecurities. Your deepest insecurities are not just thoughts you have. They're pressure points. They form quietly, often early, shaped by repetition rather than trauma. And once spoken aloud, they don't disappear. They change hands. When you tell someone where you feel inadequate, you're not just sharing information. You're providing a map. Most people won't misuse it intentionally, but intention doesn't matter. People remember what gives them context, and insecurity gives context to everything you do afterward. You might mention it casually, almost jokingly. A comment about not feeling smart enough, capable enough, confident enough. The conversation moves on. You assume it was harmless. But later, during a disagreement or a moment of distance, that same insecurity reappears. Subtle, indirect, almost accidental. A tone, a remark, a pause where reassurance should have been. And suddenly, something you once managed privately now feels externally confirmed. Jung understood this vulnerability well. He wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Your insecurity is not universal, it's specific. which is exactly why it's dangerous to hand it to someone who hasn't earned the responsibility of holding it carefully. This isn't about pretending confidence. It's about containment. Some weaknesses are meant to be strengthened through reflection, not exposed for commentary. When spoken too early or too freely, insecurity stops being something you work through and becomes something you defend against. Silence, here, isn't denial. It's protection. Because once someone knows exactly where you doubt yourself, they don't need to attack you. You'll do it for them. And that's a power you should never give away lightly. Once you learn to protect your insecurities, a subtler discipline follows, guarding your direction, not where you are, but where you intend to go. Because the moment a future is spoken aloud, it stops being internal. It becomes communal, and futures don't survive committees. That brings us to the second thing you should never tell anyone about. Your long-term plans. Long-term plans feel strongest when they exist in silence. They're unfinished, adaptable, and fueled by a private sense of momentum. But the moment you speak them, they become exposed to interpretation, and interpretation rarely leaves things intact. Most people don't hear plans neutrally. They hear them through the lens of their own experiences. Their doubts soften your confidence. Their advice competes with your instinct, and suddenly a path that felt clear in solitude feels cluttered in conversation. Consider a simple situation. You mention, briefly, that you're working toward a different career direction or a major life shift. You're not asking for validation. You're just sharing. The response is polite at first. A few questions, a pause, then concern. Practicality. Alternatives you didn't ask for. Days later, you catch yourself hesitating. Not because the plan changed, but because their reactions are still echoing. You haven't failed. You haven't quit. But the energy behind the plan has thinned. Carl Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." Long-term plans are fragile at the beginning because they aren't logical yet. They're intuitive. They don't survive interrogation. When forced to defend themselves too early, they often collapse, not from impossibility, but from pressure. There's also the quiet burden of expectation. Once you declare a plan, you feel watched. Changing course becomes something you have to explain. Silence, instead, allows refinement without embarrassment. This isn't about secrecy. It's about timing. Movement before explanation. Progress before announcement. Because the most powerful plans aren't spoken into existence. They're carried quietly until they no longer need protection. If protecting your plans preserves your future, protecting your inner conflicts preserves your clarity. Because not every internal struggle benefits from being translated into words, especially for people who aren't equipped to hear complexity without simplifying it. That brings us to the third thing you should never tell anyone about. Inner conflict is not confusion. It's negotiation. It's the process of two opposing truths trying to coexist long enough to form something more precise. But when you expose that tension too early, others rush to resolve it for you. Most people are uncomfortable with contradiction. They prefer clean conclusions. So when you admit you're torn between two values, two directions, two versions of yourself, they don't listen. They choose. Picture a common situation. You tell someone you trust that part of you wants stability, while another part wants risk. You're not asking for advice. You're articulating tension. But the response is immediate. You're overthinking it. Or worse, you know which one makes more sense. Suddenly, the conflict is framed as a problem instead of a process. One side is labeled mature, the other impulsive. And without realizing it, you start policing your own thoughts to match their conclusion. Carl Jung warned against this external interference when he wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble." Inner conflicts aren't meant to be solved quickly. They're meant to be lived with until something deeper clarifies itself. When spoken aloud too soon, they're flattened into false choices. There's also the risk of identity leakage. Once you verbalize uncertainty, others begin to relate to you as unstable, undecided, or inconsistent. They stop listening for nuance and start waiting for resolution on their timeline, not yours. Silence, here, isn't avoidance. It's incubation. It gives conflicting parts of you the space to confront each other honestly, without an audience demanding closure. Because the moment you let someone else define which part of you is right, you lose the opportunity to integrate both. And integration can't happen in public. If inner conflict needs privacy to resolve itself, self-control needs privacy to survive. Because restraint, once announced, stops being restraint. It becomes a challenge. That leads to the fourth thing you should never tell anyone about: your self-control. Self-control is most powerful when it goes unremarked. The moment you describe how much discipline you've built, what you resist now, what no longer affects you, you shift attention to the very edges of your restraint. It often happens casually. Someone comments on how calm you seem lately, how unreactive you've become. You explain that you've learned to pause, to not engage the way you once did. It feels honest, grounded. Later, the environment changes. Conversations sharpen. Boundaries are nudged. A familiar trigger is introduced under the guise of humor or curiosity. Nothing overt. Just enough to see if the old reaction still lives there. Or consider another situation. You quietly remove yourself from habits that used to drain you. When asked why, you explain your discipline. Soon, invitations become tests. The assumption forms that your control is rigid, and rigid things invite pressure. Carl Jung warned of this exposure when he wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Self-control isn't suppression, it's self-knowledge. And self-knowledge loses stability when it turns into an identity others expect you to maintain. There's also a subtler erosion. Once your discipline is known, you start performing it. You hesitate to admit struggle. You hide small lapses, not to deceive, but to protect the image. The control becomes external instead of internal. Silence prevents this shift. When restraint isn't explained, it stays fluid. You can falter privately, recalibrate, and continue without narrative or defense. Because real self-control isn't about proving strength, it's about no longer needing to demonstrate it at all. If self-control weakens when it becomes visible, change weakens when it's explained. Because transformation isn't something people recognize easily, especially when it disrupts the version of you they're comfortable remembering. That brings us to the fifth thing you should never tell anyone about: how much you've changed. Change is most convincing when it doesn't ask to be believed. The moment you explain how different you are now, you invite comparison instead of observation. And comparison always looks backward. It often starts with a simple urge to be understood. You want someone to know you're not who you were before, that your priorities shifted, that your reactions softened or sharpened, that certain patterns no longer define you. So you say it out loud. The response is rarely hostile. It's subtle. A pause, a nod. Then a reminder, a story from the past, a comment that anchors you to an earlier version of yourself, not because they doubt your growth, but because familiarity feels safer than update. Consider a common situation. You handle a difficult interaction with restraint and distance. Later, you explain that you've changed, that you don't engage the way you used to. The listener smiles and says something like, "We'll see," or "You always say that." Not cruel, just dismissive enough to make you question your own progress. Carl Jung understood this resistance when he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Becoming isn't linear, and it doesn't announce itself. When you talk about change, you unintentionally create an expectation that transformation should be permanent, visible, and consistent. And when you inevitably falter, the doubt feels louder, because it now has witnesses. There's also a quieter cost. Explaining growth keeps you tethered to your past. You're forced to narrate distance instead of living it. Silence allows separation without debate. Change doesn't need a spokesperson. It needs time to settle into behavior, so ordinary it no longer feels like change at all. Because the most profound transformations aren't declared. They're recognized long after explanation becomes unnecessary. If the previous sections have felt heavy, it's because they are. Protecting your inner world requires awareness, discipline, and sometimes uncomfortable solitude. But restraint isn't the same as isolation. Not everything needs to be hidden. Not every thought is a threat. There is a difference between what must be contained and what can be offered. Knowing this difference is perhaps the most subtle skill you can develop in your life, the ability to decide, consciously, what deserves a voice. And this leads us to the final question. What is worth sharing? If silence is a shield, what you allow through is a carefully chosen beam of light. Not every truth is dangerous. Some truths are neutral, even nourishing. Sharing them doesn't weaken you. It communicates presence, curiosity, and connection without surrendering power. First, share observations rather than wounds. Observations are safe because they describe the world outside yourself without exposing the raw vulnerabilities inside. For instance, rather than recounting every way a mistake haunts you, you can describe a realization. I noticed I react strongly to situations that feel unfair, and I'm trying to step back before responding. This communicates insight without inviting judgment or debate. Reflective situation. Imagine a colleague criticizes a decision you made at work. You could launch into a confession about how much you fear failure, or you could calmly explain, "I see where the concern comes from, and I'm adjusting my approach next time." The difference is subtle, but profound. One invites empathy with exposure. The other invites respect with clarity. Second, share what is complete rather than what is still in process. Inner struggles, conflicts, and transformations are fragile until integrated. Speaking about them prematurely risks distortion, misinterpretation, or even sabotage. Once the tension is resolved internally, however, sharing it can offer wisdom or perspective to others. Perhaps you've spent months figuring out a difficult professional decision. You now understand why you made a particular choice and how it reshaped your priorities. Sharing this insight can help someone else navigate their own path. But sharing it too early, when you're still uncertain, would have invited criticism, doubt, or unsolicited advice. Third, share boundaries without explanation. Boundaries are a rare form of honesty that doesn't expose weakness. You don't need to justify why you won't take on extra work, why you need personal time, or why certain conversations are off limits. A simple, firm statement is enough. I won't be available after 6 p.m. Or, I prefer not to discuss that topic. Boundaries convey self-respect and teach others how to treat you without giving away your internal life. Carl Jung touched on this indirectly when he wrote, "We don't really heal anything. We simply let it go." Boundaries are part of letting go of external pressures and defining what belongs to you. They're a silent assertion of agency. Fourth, share lessons learned instead of the pain endured. Pain is inherently vulnerable, but reflection transforms it into knowledge. By sharing lessons instead of wounds, you communicate growth without surrendering raw, private parts of yourself. Reflective situation. Someone asks why you left a previous job or relationship. Instead of recounting every humiliation, mistake, or moment of doubt, you can offer insight. I realized I work best when I set clear expectations for myself and others, and I'm seeking environments that match that. The focus shifts from exposing insecurity to expressing understanding. Fifth, share presence, reliability, and consistency. The unspoken truths that define character. Actions communicate far more than words ever could. Showing up, keeping promises, maintaining composure. These are all forms of expression that strengthen relationships without requiring confession. Presence is a quiet signal that you are trustworthy and grounded, and it communicates stability far more convincingly than an explanation ever could. Consider a friend who is always late, anxious, or reactive. You could lecture them on responsibility, or you could simply model consistency, arriving on time, following through on commitments, responding thoughtfully. Over time, your behavior speaks louder than anything you could articulate, and people notice without you having to announce it. Finally, share curiosity and inquiry. Questions, observations about the world, and thoughtful reflections about ideas are rarely dangerous because they don't reveal your vulnerabilities. They invite dialogue. Curiosity fosters connection without surrendering control. Asking, "What do you think about this approach?" engages others without asking them to evaluate you. The key principle throughout all of this is discernment. Words have weight, and you are responsible for where you place that weight. What you say shapes how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. Some truths demand containment, while others demand communication. Learning the difference is a lifelong practice. Jung's insight remains essential. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Sharing selectively allows your light, the parts you've integrated, the wisdom you've earned, to illuminate without exposing the unformed shadows. It allows you to connect without surrendering, to teach without explaining every wound, to influence without performing. In the end, what is worth sharing is not the raw edges of your life. It is the steady rhythm behind them, the observations, lessons, boundaries, and presence that reflect mastery over yourself rather than submission to others. Because silence is protective, but selective speech is empowering. And knowing the difference is what allows you to live fully, without losing pieces of yourself to a world eager to simplify, judge, or reshape you. You've walked through the parts of yourself most people never see. The insecurities, the conflicts, the private struggles that shape who you are. You've seen why some truths, no matter how compelling, must remain silent. and you've discovered what can be shared safely: insights, boundaries, presence, and lessons learned. Life doesn't offer clarity as a gift. It demands it as a practice. The world will constantly press for explanation, confession, or justification. It will ask you to reveal what you're not ready to give. And yet, in that tension lies a choice: to give away your power or to protect it. If this resonated with you, hit like and subscribe to stay connected. Share your thoughts in the comments. But remember, some truths are meant to be reflected on, not revealed. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, send it their way. Carefully.